find the link in the chat. Thanks again for taking part, and welcome to the most important conversation of our lives.
Thanks, Hamish. Over to you, Jake.
Thank you. This is from CERA, or Labour's Environment Campaign, and we're Labour's only affiliated organisation on the environment, and running just a year later from 1973. We're independent of the Labour Party, but have a formal role in it. We undertake research, convene dialogue, campaign, hold events like this, and have a new ground publication blog. And we campaign for mainstream, ambitious environmental policy. And we've got many front benchers who are members of CERA. And actually, anyone on this event, please join up. And similarly, details are on our website, and we'll also put these in the chat box. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jake. Okay, colleagues on the call, please, any questions you may wish to put, stick them into the Q&A box. And even if they're not got to today, which is highly unlikely because we have so little time, those will be fed into Ed's consultation. And also in terms of the chat box, we will save any of the comments. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Liam Byrne, Shadow Mayor for the West Midlands. And Liam, if you just go quickly over to Ed as well, because I'm conscious we're against time.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so thanks everyone. Great pleasure to be on the call. Very proud to be here as a member of CERA. We have now lost in our country over 45,000 people to coronavirus. We've lost over 1,000 people, over 5,000 people in our own region. And so like a lot of people on the front line in the Labour Party at the moment, our focus is very much on saving lives and saving livelihoods. We all know that earthquakes have got aftershocks, and we know that coronavirus is going to have probably the biggest economic aftershock that we've seen in this country since the 1930s. That is why we need the government to step up now to put in place a plan for a just green recovery on a scale that we've just never seen before. Now, one of the reasons that I'm standing for mayor in the West Midlands is that I genuinely think that in the region that ignited the carbon revolution 200 or 300 years ago, we can now lead the zero carbon revolution, and we can put in place a set of policies and proposals that will help us become the first city region to go net zero carbon, but also demonstrate practical lessons in action that Labour can pick up nationally, that Ed can take into office in the next Labour government to put our country on a course to a faster and greener future. Now, we think that in our region, we will need something like £3.5 billion of capital stimulus next year. That is a brilliant opportunity to build back better. You could use that money to build over 10,000 homes, to retrofit over 100,000 homes, to solar panel 200,000 homes, and by the way, create 92,000 jobs. But what that means, what that needs is a mayor who's actually prepared to step up and help lead the argument to fight our corner in Westminster, rather than someone who's prepared to kowtow to Boris Johnson. Crucially, it requires us as a region to set our sights on a far more ambitious target to become net zero carbon. At the moment, we have a Tory mayor that's gone for 2041. That is much, much too late. We need to be aiming at a time frame that is much, much quicker than that. And that's why I've said we want to be the first city region to go net zero carbon in the country. And we think that we can do it with the right help. So we're very much looking forward to this call. We're developing our manifesto quickly now over the next 2 or 3 months. Very pleased to say that Jake and Lisa have important parts in that. But we genuinely want to be a trailblazer, a pioneer, to show the rest of the country and indeed the rest of the world how it can be done. I'll stop there, and a great pleasure at that to hand over to my colleague, Ed Miliband, who I know has a difficult day in Parliament today.
Liam, thanks so much. And I want to say a big thank you to Lisa, to Hamish, to Jake, and to you, and to everybody on this call. And I want to acknowledge the great work that CERA and Labour Business do, which is really important for the Labour Party. And thanks to all of the people who've joined this call from business and from elsewhere. As Liam has sort of indicated, I've got the second reading of a bill this afternoon, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to jump off around 5-ish, and I really apologise for that. It's hard to control the events in Parliament, but I've got my office is on this call, and we're going to be listening very hard to what people have to say. I suppose just a few things sort of by way of introduction. I think we're at an absolutely critical juncture when it comes to the economy and also the environment and nature, because we're only at the end of the beginning, really, when it comes to the economic crisis that we're facing. And I think this is a moment when we're going to be tested as a country. Are we going to see the kind of activist government that led to the furlough carried over, that activism carried over into recovery? And the decisions that government makes around that will have a massive impact on people's job prospects, what happens to businesses, and whether we build back better. So that's really the first thing that I wanted to say. Secondly, why do we want a green recovery? Why should we have a green recovery? Because it makes sense from every point of view. It makes sense because if you want to get money spent quickly in a way that is going to create jobs, it's the right thing to do. Some people have seen today that there's some noise around about whether the government should persist with its 9 billion retrofit promise, the promise they made around energy efficiency, whether they should bring that forward. Absolutely they should. Dominic Cummings is apparently skeptical about it, but it can create tens of thousands of jobs in our country. It can cut people's bills, and it can be good for our environment. So this makes sense from a jobs point of view. It makes sense, as I think Liam implied, from a building back better point of view. You know, people have been through so much in this crisis. People have lost so much. I don't think they just want to go back to the way things were. I think they want things to be better, whether that's in relation to air quality or nature. And there are so many jobs that need doing when it comes to the low carbon economy and the zero carbon economy. Take manufacturing, and indeed Liam is a great advocate for manufacturing in the West Midlands. You know, whether it's steel or aerospace or automotive, they are crying out for support to go low carbon. And that's what we see in other countries like France. We see in the aerospace sector alone 1.5 billion euros being pledged for the zero carbon engines of the future. So you know, there isn't a shortage of jobs to be done when it comes to this transition. It's about building back better, and crucially, it makes value for money sense as well, because we know as a country we're going to have to spend this money. We know as a country we're going to have to make this green transition. Why not get ahead of the game now when we know we're going to need investment for a green stimulus? And I suppose that takes me to the wider point I wanted to make, which is what I want to try and achieve as Shadow Business and Energy Secretary in terms of the debate. The climate emergency is a disaster that we've got to tackle and avoid happening. But it's also a moment when we can build better lives for people. And I think that the climate emergency, if you like, has sat only in the environmental box for too long. It's about economic justice. It's about social justice. It's about answering the question that so many people are asking, which is, what job are my son or daughter going to do in the future? How can we build a better society than we have at the moment? How can we have a healthier society than we can have at the moment? And crucially, and we learn this from coronavirus, how do we follow the science? So I think this is an incredibly important moment. We are going to be, in a constructive way, pushing government to make the right decisions for our country. I hope you'll contribute to our consultation. And this is really just the beginning of the engagement that I want to have with the business community and others in how we create the kind of society that we need to, and how we show the urgency. And there is real urgency. We know we've got a decade. That's what the UNFCCC has said to us about the scale of the task. We've got to go as fast as we can over the next decade. Our 2019 manifesto talked about the majority of our of decarbonisation happening over the next decade. Absolutely, we should have that ambition. And that is absolutely an ambition I support. And that's what we want to achieve.
Absolutely brilliant. So big challenge, but huge opportunities for communities and business in taking forward a green recovery. Okay, I'm going to ask Jake if you've got just for a minute or so some reflections from Sarah's work on the green recovery. Unmute yourself, Jake.
Yeah, so thank you, Ed, and thank you, Liam. from Sarah's perspective, we just wanted to highlight a couple of things really. One is we can't really dust down the same arguments because from before COVID, and we need to recognise that people are very concerned by the security, and we need to show that a green recovery is more resilient and secure, and that will help build the consent needed for all the changes. So when we talk about green homes, actually we should be talking about zero energy bill homes. They're warm, save people money on energy and cut emissions and create jobs. And the low carbon industries are more resilient as they were in the last financial crisis. So jobs are key, and I think we'll hear more about that. And we've got some of the worst workplace engagement, skill levels in the OECD. Unions help anchor pay and skills. So why not a sort of new future skills fund that brings union sectors and supply chains to co-bid for funding with skills institutions to train and retrain workers for those jobs in the new economy, not just solar panels, but right across it, as Ed said. Liam spoke in the West Midlands, absolutely agree, need to devolve powers to the most appropriate level. We need thousands of climate conversations across the country, building awareness, understanding consent with citizens' assemblies, deliberate approaches. It can't happen at Whitehall desk or dispatch box. And so there should be a new commitment to empower the most local level and give funds and powers. And last to localities. And lastly, we need to recognise that environment crisis is a health crisis. And COVID's shown how important healthcare systems are, underlying respiratory and health problems which have exacerbated COVID. And the climate catastrophe is the biggest health crisis we face, and we must talk and act in this way. And so, and there's been mounting mental health crisis as well through COVID, and how important public space and access to nature are for good mental health. So that should signal a huge change in how we plan and build, give people a new right to clean air and access to a public space and nature, and with a Green Guardian body with statutory powers to act on local concerns. There's just some areas.
Okay, right. Thanks for a very comprehensive response there. Catherine, could I just ask for some quick reflections, questions from Labour Business? You need to...
Certainly. So thank you for your time today. We've had quite a lot of questions. I think I'll leave it to later on to speak about energy and the different sectors. But just generally, I suppose we've got some concerns from particularly small businesses that they might be left out in this green recovery. Now, how do we make sure that small businesses benefit from this and that disadvantaged communities up and down the country are not forgotten, particularly in the hurry to kickstart initiatives with these shovel-ready projects that we're seeing through via the devolved authorities at the moment? Be quite interested to hear your thoughts on that. And second of all, really on skills. So apprenticeship skills jobs will obviously be key to this recovery. The levy system isn't working, particularly for small businesses. What will be your, how will you join up a skills strategy for the economic recovery and make sure that there are green apprenticeships at all levels?
Okay. Thanks for that, Catherine. And maybe if we sort of move from that into the sort of first round of questions that we've had through, that's very much been about business interests and where actually, given the sheer complexity and uncertainty, how can, through the regional structures, through lobbying of Parliament, how can we actually ensure that UK manufacturing, UK small businesses actually have a role to play within the green recovery, that actually there will be the support for the jobs? And alongside that, how do we actually balance the need for private investment? So Ed, I don't know if you want to come back first on that.
I think it's a really important point. And just take this issue of I think this is something where we can help the private sector as well as the public sector to make the change, because it will help small businesses to be able to be part of this, and it'll help with our carbon emissions, and it'll help their costs. So I think there's masses we can do. I think there's massive opportunity in the green economy. I talked about manufacturing and the supply chain. You know, actually, if we really invested in some of our manufacturing capabilities around low carbon, whether it's in automotive or in aerospace, for example, it will help all of those companies threatened in the supply chain as well. And then there's something else which I think was just raised earlier by Catherine, and that is about this issue of retraining. I mean, I think we should be doing everything we can to stop workers losing their employment. But for those workers that do lose their employment, like for example, we've seen these redundancies announced at Rolls-Royce, you know, we absolutely have got to give those workers the retraining that they need and get them into the green industries of the future. And I think it's a real problem. In the last Labour government, there was something called the Rapid Reaction Task Force, which used to go in when there were redundancies and actually act. And I don't know why we don't have that now. And I don't know why it's not retraining people for the green industries of the future.
Liam?
Yeah, I mean, just to second that, I mean, I think what is now needed is a new grand bargain with business, which you might call a grand green bargain. So the chance to begin putting this in place is in about a week and a half's time at the budget, because the truth is that UK manufacturing may not make it through this current crisis. We've got significant numbers of redundancies already announced, and we fear that a lot more are in the pipeline. So the question, I think, is how do we bring forward assistance, green assistance, that is conditional on businesses doing the right thing for the years to come and signing up to the right kinds of commitments on emissions. Now, if you talk to most manufacturers, certainly in the Midlands, they'll say that there are 2 or 3 areas that really make up significant amounts of their costs. So one is around energy, one is around skills, and one is around land. And this is where we need the kind of rapid reaction response that Ed talked about, because we could be putting in place good measures that are good for the environment around skills, energy and land to underpin the transformation of these businesses' cost base. And we should be offering to do that in return for those businesses doing the right thing on carbon emissions going forward. The challenge that we've got at the moment is this strategic incoherence on the ground. So as Catherine mentioned, you know, we've got LEPs being asked for their proposals, we've got councils being asked for their proposals, we've got the Combined Authority being asked for its proposals, you've got colleges putting forward their ideas, universities putting forward their ideas. So what you're going to get is a whole mishmash of ideas and no strategy. No one actually saying, well, look, what is the best use of public money in this particular place in order to help us deliver a recovery that is rich in jobs and a recovery that is good for the environment too. So that is one of the things that we're trying to do in the West Midlands. It's one of the things that we want your help with, is joining up that kind of single picture for a recovery plan that gives us that just green recovery.
Okay, Ed, whilst we've still got you, a challenge sort of back that clearly you touched on it, not all businesses necessarily will have a future in a green economy, and what some businesses have actually shown during COVID, and an example's been given by a number of people on how they switched what they made to things that were useful for the COVID emergency. How do we actually support and enable those businesses who've got to fundamentally change what they're currently making into something different and new? How do we put together that kind of infrastructure that's going to help them make the change?
A really good point, Lisa. Look, I think one of the things we've learned during this crisis is that if government puts its mind to it, all of the things that we were told were not possible are absolutely doable. I mean, you know, the fact that we built the Nightingale hospitals in whatever it was, a matter of weeks, I think shows what can be achieved. And this point about the just transition, it's incredibly important. And the just transition is about businesses and it is about workers. Now, what do you need for a just transition? I think you need to plan the transition. That's why I think in relation to aviation and aerospace, the government's sort of hands-off approach has been wrong. I've been saying, look, why not take equity stakes in say, for example, some of the airlines, so that you can save the jobs and ensure they go green. So you've got a plan. You know, I know as a Doncaster MP what happens when you have an unplanned transition, because we saw it in relation to the pits and we saw generational disadvantage as a result. So you need to plan the transition. Secondly, you need to recognize that businesses can adapt. They can change. There was something called the Lucas Plan in the 1970s, which was a plan to try and help aerospace, for example, Lucas Aerospace, actually adapt. Now, I think we can have a longer transition than that, but there's definitely ways that businesses can be helped to adapt. And then thirdly, for any worker who is displaced, they've got to have the support. They've got to have the help. And so it's those three elements, Lisa, and it does require something very important. It requires active government. And boy, we've seen active government during this crisis, but active government can't just be for the initial phase of the crisis. It's got to endure as we not only seek to emerge from a very, very deep recession, but as we make the green transition.
Okay. So an interesting point that a number of people are reflecting on is how important green space has become to our day-to-day living during the COVID crisis. And actually, how do we actually put the importance of nature and green space at the
Lisa, I'm sorry, I just interrupt for a second. I'm really sorry, but Liam will attest to this, that the whips, you have to follow the advice of the whips. They've sort of jiggled around the parliamentary business. So my bill is shortly about to start.
Okay,
so
go.
There'll be an empty space in the chamber if I don't drop off the call. I really apologize.
Thank you so much for your time, and we will forward all the questions to you.
Send us your comments and thoughts.
Brilliant. Thank you. Take care.
See ya.
Okay, Liam, so you get to pick that one up. The importance of green space, and how do we actually put a value on green space, given the sort of absolute pressures on public finances. And can I also welcome onto the panel Matthew Pennycook, who is Shadow Climate Minister, and I believe will be also fielding some questions as part of this. But back to you.
Lisa, thank you. So we would need to plant a forest the size of Tunisia in the West Midlands in order to absorb all of the carbon that we produce every year, which kind of gives you a sense that we can't plant our way out of this crisis. But we do need to, I think, plant as part of our response. And I think that there is good politics in this, as well as measures which are good for the economy. So there's only been one national forest planted in the last 1,000 years. It's by and large in the East Midlands, from Milkwood up to Charnwood. It's actually brought in significant amount of investment into the East Midlands. It's one of the things we would like to do. We would like to plant Britain's second national forest in the West Midlands, potentially replanting Shakespeare's old Forest of Arden. It's one of the things that we think that we can do. But I think more closer to home, certainly closer to my home, what we have found in Birmingham, in particular in inner city Birmingham, is that there is just a new appetite, I think, to bring nature back into the urban fabric. We had a fascinating project on one of our estates, one of our poorest estates, not long ago, when actually we brought in an ecological charity that was teaching older residents how to basically plant fruit orchards on the Sutton estate. And what was fascinating about this was the way it actually began to get community back together again, doing something very practical, doing something that brought generations together, and something that made a big impact on the area. So I think that there will be a real kind of appetite just to begin bringing nature back into the urban fabric on a completely different kind of scale. And obviously the lack of cars and the cleaner air that we've had over the last kind of 12 weeks has really focused minds on how we preserve some of the environmental progress that has been made by taking traffic off the roads. So I think you're going to find in the local elections next year, you're going to find an awful lot of people running for council who are actually going to be proposing very practical proposals to become a better home for nature in their ward. Certainly that is something that we're going to try and do in the West Midlands, not just on a ward level, not just on a street level, but also on a forest level too, just to show that it can be done at speed and it can be done with scale.
Okay. As somebody who's currently bearing the scars of trying to introduce a low traffic neighbourhood, let's hope that momentum does build up a bit quicker. Series of questions that are coming through, and I think it's a sort of important sort of philosophical one for both you and Matt to pick up on. Actually, when we talk about climate change and the desire for a healthier, greener environment, how can that be compatible with the issue of economic growth? Can you do growth and can you do environment? Matt, do you want to go first?
That's a really big question, Lisa. I mean, I think you can do clean green growth, but I do think, and maybe this is the point that those questions are trying to get at, I do think we need to open up a conversation about consumption and about the way we live our lives. And one of the interesting findings, I don't know if people saw from the UK Climate Assembly, they did a special COVID-related extra session, members of the UK Climate Assembly. And there was a surprising, I thought, surprisingly high levels of support for government supporting measures that around lifestyle change. So we've got to get to grips with some of this. And you may have seen some of the bailouts that are taking place across Europe. For example, Air France bailout. They're not only tying in conditionality relating to the environment on, say, the type of fuels being used, but challenging that airline to look at its domestic flights and how they can be reduced. I do think we do need to engage with the issue of consumption. But that's not to say that we can't have economic growth that is not net zero aligned. And just going back to what Liam was just talking about there, I mean, nature restoration is one of the most obvious, along with energy efficiency, EV infrastructure and other things that this government bring forward in the summer statement that that are net zero aligned, that will help create jobs and help the recovery.
Okay, Liam, can we do green and grow?
So this is the question that a lot of voters are asking about now. So as we've been debating this across the West Midlands over the last couple of weeks in particular, people know that as a society, as an economy, we have got to go green. In a way, people do now see the arguments around green a little bit like the arguments around white heat 30, 40 years ago. They see it as positive, they see it as future, and they see it as actually pretty critical to their kids and grandkids and earning a livelihood, having a planet to live on. What they worry about is how quickly we can get there. And people almost feel on the horns of a dilemma now. So they argue about whether we need to go back to normal first and then go green. And I think one of the things we're going to have to do as a party is just actually say, no, actually, we can square this circle. We can go green in a way that gets us back on our feet. But that requires practical, job-rich measures. And actually, we have not found, I mean, there hasn't been a ton of great stuff published. There was a very good piece by some folks at Oxford a month or so ago on just kind of what are the wealth of measures that are both good for the environment and good for creating jobs too. But, a lot of the evidence base is not as good as it should be. That is actually where we need a great deal more R&D. So I think the circle can be squared, but I don't think we should kid ourselves about the political task that we've got ahead, because people genuinely struggle right now with whether it's either or, and we've got to persuade them that it's both.
Okay. An interesting point that some people are bringing up is we're out of power nationally, but clearly we have the opportunity to be in power in a number of our regions and our metro areas. And how do we actually, as a party, ensure that the true role of local government, regional authorities are brought through in terms of the facilitation and support to both a green recovery and equally a distinct and different local economy? Liam, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So, well, one of the ways in which we do that is we unite some of these arguments with arguments that the Co-op Party has been putting forward for some time, and we rewire local economies, and that's certainly something that we're going to try and do on the scale of the West Midlands economy. So we're the biggest Metro area outside London, but many of the ideas that we're looking to pioneer are ideas that have been pioneered in places like Preston. So building an approach to our economy that puts trickle down back in the deep history to which it belongs, and bringing forward an economic development approach based on community wealth building, is the fountainhead of most of our economic thinking at the moment. And so some of you may have seen this, but we've set up a co-op task force, which we launched about a week ago. And that will be looking at how we bring a co-op approach to developing measures that will help us decarbonise the economy. Community wealth building is the absolute core of that. The second thing we've got to do, though, is we've got to basically learn the lessons from local government about 120 years ago. So Birmingham was the place that was the pioneer of the civic gospel. We used to call it gas and water socialism, but it basically came down to building new institutions, whether that was a municipal savings bank or municipally owned gas and water companies. We have to build back 21st century municipal institutions to help us go greener faster. And frankly, if we did it 120 years ago, we can do it again now. But these ideas that we develop, test, pioneer, prove at the local level could have an absolutely fundamental impact on Labour nationally, because we have always renewed as a party in local government. That was true of Attlee's Labour. It was true in the 1980s. And that is one of the things we've got to be able to do this time around. And when we're kind of trying to win votes amongst what is quite a cynical electorate, it's a hell of a lot easier to say, look, action speaks louder than words. Let me show you examples that Labour have delivered around the country about how these things can work in practice. That, frankly, will be amongst the best evidence that we can bring to bear as we set about winning the next general election.
Okay, so Matt, Labour gets into power next time. Are you then going to be prepared to cede power to the cities and regions?
Well, I think what Liam just said there is absolutely spot on in the sense of there's a huge amount going on locally. There's a huge amount of experimentation where, you know, in our metro regions, in towns and local authorities, lots of work is going on. There's lots we can learn for. I think the important thing that, you know, I would emphasize is that we cannot get to zero without local communities. And we can't do a green recovery properly without buy-in from those local communities. So take an energy efficiency program that was serious. You would want to be doing it, in my view, street by street, you know, town by town. It will need to be tailored to the particular area of the country. You know, so the question for me is not our metro region areas, regions, towns, local authorities important. Is what do they need from government? You know, funding being the obvious one, but what powers do they need to be able to take some of this stuff forward? Because there's no lack of enthusiasm out there, I think, to get on with it. But it's what do we need from central government to support them? You know, and that's where our focus is, and ensuring, particularly in terms of a just transition, how do we help those areas that are going to need more help to be able to make that transition to a low carbon economy?
Okay. I'm going to bring a set of questions together in a minute about a just transition, but whilst we're still sort of reflecting a little bit on that sort of broader approach, where do both you, Liam and Matt, see how do we actually facilitate private investment? Private investment has been an important part of securing investment in renewables. And where do you see things like the financial services, the insurance companies, how can they all come together to contribute to that broader picture? Sorry, my dog's barking in the background.
So there's two things for me here now. So obviously government can borrow right now at interest rates that are close to zero. And so what we should be doing is we should be raising significant investment funds that we can use to co-finance significant infrastructure that we need. And you know, the transition to clean energy is absolutely one of those investments that we should be making. The second thing, though, that we're really interested in the West Midlands is how we set up our own regional investment bank that allows us to mobilise savings inside our region to allow people to actually invest in helping their economy, their local economy, create jobs and go green. And it could well be that we can bring to the table big institutions like the West Midlands pension funds, because obviously pension investors are investing very, very long term. Now, as it happens, there's a much bigger group of people who are now co-investing in pensions for the very long term, because auto-enrolled pensions have now rolled out to 12 million people. It means that we have more people who are now saving who are now investing in pension savings than we've ever had before in this country. Crucially, a lot of that money will be going into equities. So on average, I've got the library to work this out for me last week. So on average, people will be investing about £78,000 in equities over the course of their lives. How do we make sure that people know they're investing in good companies? How do we create that information and transparency that encourages them to invest in companies that are doing the right thing? It's one of the big changes in company law that we need to make. So we should be mobilizing investment that we use to co-finance in good infrastructure. We should be setting up financial institutions like our own regional investment bank. Again, we did this once before. Birmingham Municipal Savings Bank opened in the basement of the water department in the Birmingham Council House back in 1913. It was opened by someone called Neville Chamberlain, you may have heard of. And then crucially, just helping people invest wiser. You know, these are three sort of very practical things that we can do for the future.
Matt?
Oh, sorry, Lisa. Just reinforcing there what Liam said, in the sense, I think government can be smart about how it collaborates and de-risks investment, if you like, to bring crowd in private finance of projects. We could set the ambition, you know, we were instrumental in a sense in raising the government's ambition for the amount of offshore wind capacity, for example. We need to be looking, I think, at taking the caps in place on CFDs higher or getting rid of them at all. We just need some of this at pace. So you've got to bring the private finance in, absolutely. I think on the finance side, I think Liam's right. I think we're going to need some kind of investment bank and regional investment banks that are net zero focused, that as a particular kind of focus of their remit. I think more broadly than that, though, we need a framework for business that gives them certainty about where to take the investments. And I think key for that would be the disclosure around climate risk. So the government is in principle committed to this, but we should be making TCFD financial reporting mandatory far sooner than the government is allowing, because that would, you know, the framework then for business to know what you've got to bring forward, and we'll get that transparency that I think will drive this. But there is a sense out there, we've generally seen this with BP asset sell-off and other things, that the big oil majors and the financial world in general is waking up to the fact that the energy transition is accelerating, and they risk being left high and dry if they don't move far more quickly than they are. You know, and it's important they move. The UK's carbon footprint is 1% of the world, but the city is invested in 15%. You know, the City of London can be a big driver if it gets really serious. So the work Mark Carney and others are doing is important, but I think at a board level and in more generally, we've got to get, you know, transparency around disclosure and reporting, you know, and do what we can to nudge along the very clear trend, which is, you know, a realization that fossil fuels are not going to be profitable in the long run. You're going to have stranded assets, and you'll be looking to diversify and transition far more quickly.
Okay. Picking up on some of the points, Liam, you touched on in terms of the challenges within the West Midlands region, Northwest, Northeast, that sheer level of inequality and deprivation. How are we going to actually make action on climate real and relevant to the mum in the masonette? You know, heat or eat is the daily dilemma for too many of our citizens. And how can we actually start to show that climate is real? Is it our air quality programs? Is it our housing retrofit programs? What kind of policies will be brought forward that can be real to those communities in our key areas?
So I think it's probably worth you sharing some of your work in Druid Heath on this. So for those of you who don't know, Druid Heath is a pretty deprived estate in the south of Birmingham, where Lisa and a number of other colleagues have been, trying to unpack exactly some of these narratives. So in my experience, there are basically three arguments that are important. So one is that people know we're heading in this direction and they genuinely worry about whether there will be work for them in that future. And that's why the right to work and the right to train and retrain is so important. So in the West Midlands, we've proposed that not just do we have a capital stimulus, we need that, but actually job guarantees and the right to train, absolutely crucial in helping people move through this transition. At the moment, further education is left out of the conversation about how we build back better. That's crazy. I mean, our colleges in our region need about 650 million in capital investment to create a technical training system that will actually help our population break out of this low pay, low skill equilibrium that we've got. Second thing we've got to do, though, is make the point about cleaner air. So people absolutely, I think, understand the importance of cleaner air, longer lives now. It's something that people have thought about quite a lot over the last 12 weeks. We have been thinking about this in Birmingham. We think like one of the measures that we could do that actually make a difference is actually, pervasive air quality monitoring at playgrounds, for example, so that parents can actually see how toxic the air is in a playground now that they've just driven their kids to school and back. Just simple measures like that help people make actionable decisions in day-to-day life that are good for the environment. But cleaner air, absolutely crucial as part of the argument. And then the third argument is obviously cost. So we're quite interested in how we can take a lesson from the Welsh Assembly government and really expand community ownership of renewable energy facilities. We think that not only cuts people's fuel bills, but it actually gives them an economic stake in their local community. Like literally gives them an economic stake in part of the infrastructure in their community. So not just thinking about costs, but actually thinking about wealth building too is one of the things that we think that we can give people. And we want to do this in a cooperative way. Certainly we want to test those ideas. But I think there's a range of ways now in which you can actually begin having this conversation with people. And I think we've got some way to go. We're going to have to make some mistakes, and we're going to have to experiment with, some different policy approaches to this. But people know that this is where we're going. They are worried about how quickly we get there. In people's minds, a lot of people think greener is more expensive, and so this is part of our role as political leaders, I suppose, is showing how we can square this circle. And it is possible to go greener faster in a way that is good for jobs and good for the cost of living. Okay.
Matt, maybe I could pick up with you on a sort of broader point that's been picked up in terms of the real challenge of house building, the need for more housing, huge need for housing supply, and also obviously the massive challenge of housing retrofit, and actually how we actually define zero carbon within the lifetime of a housing programme. Seems to be a key question for business, as well as the community. How can you actually say something zero carbon if you're actually building homes?
Apologies, Lee, for that bell in the background. Maybe I'll come in a second when it finishes after Liam perhaps can maybe fill for a bit. Otherwise, you're going to have the comments.
Okay. Yep. All right. So I think we know that we're going to need significant investment in retrofits. The wrong thing to do would be to put out a traditional contract in a business as usual way to a large company that is registered in the British Virgin Islands, doesn't pay taxes, isn't good on trade union rights, and doesn't pay £10 an hour. That would be the wrong approach to doing this. What we need to do with retrofit is actually think from the outset about how do we support small businesses and cooperatives that are creating jobs in low-income areas. And so, like a lot of places, you know, we want, in Birmingham, we have a Charter for Social Responsibility. Actually using that properly to shape our procurement rules is one of the ways that we can bend the investment that should be coming in to retrofit in a way that is good for jobs. And in the one of the pieces that I posted in the chat just a little bit, so it's Cameron Hepburn's piece. If for those who haven't read it, Cameron Hepburn and Nick Stern actually did a very good piece that looked around the world at all of the measures that governments are considering that are both good for the environment and good for jobs. Retrofitting is the, you know, the one measure I think that really kind of stands out as, you know, amongst measures that create the most jobs and are good for the environment. That is obviously where significant investment needs to go. That's why it's really worrying that Dominic Cummings is trying to backtrack on the commitments that have been made so far. But when we're putting that money in, we need to think about doing it in a way that is good for white van man and woman, because actually those are the kinds of jobs that people are interested in training up in for the future.
Okay.
The bell stopped now, Matt.
I'll stop to apologise for the bell.
Okay, so what I'm interested in is, it's a point a number of the corporate support. Do we actually look at whole life carbon rather than input carbon in terms of zero carbon in homes?
I think that's a really good point. I mean, we can go into the technicalities of EP standards or passive house. I think
I was hoping to not go too technical.
But I think what's important is A, the investment, but B, the product standards, if you like. And, you know, and we all know how this has been rolled back over recent years in terms of zero carbon homes and the rest of it. We've got to get those standards back in. I know Thangam Debonair, as the new Shadow Housing Secretary, is really focused on that and making that a big part of the offer that we want to develop. We've got to have those product standards in terms of new build houses. Goes back to an earlier point actually you made as well, Lisa, was one of the questions which we've got to do more to incentivise in terms of public gain from developers, green space and natural space within developments in urban areas. Some of the things that pass for playgrounds in my own constituency that developers just add on are appalling actually, and don't, you know, give children and others the space they need. So, you know, it's a big part of an agenda on standards. And then on retrofit, I think we've got to tailor this to as a street by street, town by town, because it's a big national program. One size fits all, I don't think is going to deliver what we need. I think it's got to be very localized. But doing it is a no-brainer, because in terms of creation and the multiplier effect, the energy efficiency, and you'll have all seen the CCC's and progress report last week. Energy efficiency is almost, it's clear from reading that, their number one ask. What they're very clear about is the 9.2 billion pledged in the Tory manifesto for this in itself is not enough. It's welcome, but it's not enough. So that's where it goes back to Liam's point. The idea that this is being tussled over in government because this is not a flashy enough project, I just find it incredible. We've got to have, to get to net zero, we've got to have flashy stuff and the non-flashy stuff. It's got to be economy-wide. We're talking about a systems change here, not just tinkering around with policy to get where we need to go. So product standards and retrofit, I say that, and the important thing about retrofit in terms of job creation is this is not geographically focused, it's countrywide, like EV charging infrastructure. These are creating jobs in every part of the country, given the scale of the housing overhaul that needs to take place.
Okay, so I suppose one of the key issues that come up, and it comes up time and time again for those who've already prepared for zero carbon in the past, is are we, through our green recovery programme, through the approaches that we take, are we going to be providing some certainty? Because actually, when you're starting to work out whether a development stacks now, you will be thinking about what will be required in 3-5 years' time. So it is important for a developer, for an investor, to actually understand when will Labour be making absolutely clear what its technical requirements are.
You're asking me when that will obviously form part of the manifesto. We'll get into our technical building requirements. But it's focus. All I can say at this point is it's something. The first conversation I had with Thangam about housing, she said, how do we make energy efficiency front and center of what's going to be our offer. So it's very much at the forefront of our minds. But I think they need to know from us that the direction of travel, which is we want standards to be higher than they are, and we're going to look to undo some of the damage that the government have done by relaxing those standards, abolishing zero carbon homes.
Fab. So Liam, you will have a significant potential housing programme before you. You will have a significant potential to invest in transport. How would you see setting the conditions and the certainty for investment in the West Midlands?
So I've proposed what we're calling our Green Development Corporation in the West Midlands, and that is partly because we need to unlock about £1 billion worth of borrowing capacity that our Tory mayor has left on the table. Now is a good time to unlock that borrowing capacity because interest rates are so low. But what that allows us to do is to begin co-financing housing development in ways that make two differences. So one, we can dramatically increase the mix of social housing, and I would like council housing, because those of you on the call who are councillors or have been involved in planning decisions, I mean, you know what it's like. Developer brings forward proposal. There's a bit of argy-bargy about how much social housing is in the mix. The planning permission goes through, and then it all gets very difficult all of a sudden, and the social housing component is dialed down. Well, we need to stop that drift away from social housing. So using the Mayor's Office and the Green Development Corporation to co-finance these deals is one of the ways in which we can max out the social housing component. But the second is obviously we can insist on housing standards. And as we begin to insist on the highest standards possible, what that begins to do is it begins to change the supply chain in a region that is pretty large, the largest metro mayor economy outside of London. Once you've begun to change supply chains and industry players, and they begin competing on the basis of their environmental standards, then you're beginning to change the market dynamics very significantly. I would like, firms, house building firms in the West Midlands to feel it's a competitive advantage for them to be based in the West Midlands, building at the highest possible standards. So we may be an early adopter market. They may kind of cut their teeth, learn how to do it, invest in scale, in the West Midlands, as a way of actually then positioning themselves for the UK national market. So I think there's a couple of just very, very practical things that we can do. And this isn't rocket science. I mean, we've done all of these kinds of things before. So this is no policy novelty. This is just about kind of uniting our values with some practical politics.
Okay. So a final sort of question, I think, before we come back for both of you to have an opportunity to sum up. And it's on HS2. And we have had a number have come forward. And I know for our region, it's something the Young Climate Strikers see as quite important. How do we actually square support for something like HS2, given the comparatively short advantage it gives in terms of time, with the potential destruction to the countryside? How do we actually balance that and articulate the value as we see it?
You want to kick off? Yeah. So this is difficult. I mean, the reality is High Speed 2 is happening. It's happening now, and given Labour is out of office for the next 4 years, no matter what you think about High Speed 2, it is happening. Personally, I've been a supporter for a long time, for the simple reason that we need more railways in this country. The capacity that we have is exhausted. And if you're going to build new railway lines, you might as well make them high speed, because you just get more trains on the line. Now, there are two things that we have to do, in my view, therefore, to then offset the negative impact. One is to invest more in the offsetting measures that are needed to protect the environment. And at the moment, we don't see High Speed 2. I mean, they're doing a reasonable job on this, but you don't see a lot of ministerial pressure on them to go further. But the second thing we have to do is we have to drive forward the logic that High Speed 2 offers us, which is to basically create a hell of a lot more capacity on additional regional networks. So by building by basically using the extra capacity we get on the West Coast Main Line, building out connections like tram and local rail connections to that West Coast Main Line capacity, you can create a hell of a lot more ways of getting people off the road. Ultimately, High Speed 2 creates enough capacity in our region to take about 1 million trucks off the road each year. That is a hell of a lot of that saves us some great damage to the environment. But that only happens if we drive through on things like congestion charging when it comes to freight, and making sure the capacity is actually there to take those trucks off the road. So I can see the prize, but the prize doesn't flow automatically from just building High Speed 2. There's a hell of a lot of other stuff that you've got to do as well. And I suppose in my darkest moments, I worry that the Tories don't really care about that stuff. And so, it's going to have to be Labour that brings that argument to the table.
I share your worries. Okay, so we're looking at the whole HS2 within a whole system change approach is
exactly. Yeah.
What
That's a much pithier way of putting it. Yeah.
Matt,
I'm sure there's a huge amount I can add to Liam's answer there. It's happening. It's about setting, I think, some of the more problematic aspects of it.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so I think it'd be good to have some final words from both of you. And I think a number of questions that we've had a huge amount of questions that have come in. And I would really, really like to thank all the people who've put forward questions. And I certainly, for one, will be reviewing them all, because I think it's just really important that we get to understand all the different perceptions because of the sheer complexity of this issue. But I suppose one of the areas that is constantly coming up and again and again and again, that we're not just talking about one transition. This, and Ed referred to it, this is not actually just a climate issue, that for some areas, parts of the West Midlands, we are still suffering from previous transitions. We haven't actually recovered from deindustrialization. How, given all that level of complexity, uncertainty, the added layer of things like AI, digitalization, how are we going to create what this is set out to be, the big, fair, green recovery? If you were to say, what were the top 3 things that you as panelists would put forward as your way to do it? Matt, do you want to kick off?
I can have the, I mean, in a sense that I just encourage people to go and take up the CCC's report, because in many ways it's done the government's work for it, not just why we need to do that, how you make the transition, how you get back on track, not for net zero, but the previous less stringent emissions reductions targets we had. I think what's important, and just picking up a few of the themes of the conversation since I joined the call, we've got to take people with us. This has got to be, the green agenda has got to be a working class agenda. I don't think we were on a big call with the trade unions the other day. The trade unions aren't brought into this conversation enough about how we transition justly. I think how we talk about it as an aside is important as well. When you talk to people about climate or the just transition, those phrases don't resonate with them. We've got to put this into language that the communities that we want to represent and we'll need to take with us understand. But I think instead of 3 topics, I just break it down into, there are the very obvious things that we know we need to do, that we know we just need to get on with, and the government just needs to do those. So renewables, EV infrastructure, energy efficiency, nature restoration, it can just get on with it. And then I think, and this is a slightly longer term piece, we've got to start looking at how we, in a sense, make the green agenda central to our industrial strategy. We get moving on those longer term and trickier things. Hydrogen, got no hydrogen strategy. The Germans are pumping £5 billion to hydrogen in their stimulus program. We still haven't got a hydrogen strategy. So some of the longer term thinking has got to be built into the recovery, as well as the very, very obvious things that the government should have done already, can announce in tomorrow if it's Johnson, or a week or so's time if it's Rishi Sunak, put us on the way. And the last point I'd make is we've got to reassess, we've got to urge the government to reassess some of the things it's already announced. For example, I would say the big road building programme that was announced in the budget. Because I think the worst outcome in coming weeks in terms of a green recovery would be, yes, we get a couple of nice headline green measures, but in there's lots of brown and grey measures as well that mean the whole thing doesn't add up to the type of transformative system change we know we need. We've got a decade to do it, so let's just get on and do it.
Okay. Liam.
So what I would say to people on the call is come and help us figure out how to do this in the West Midlands. So the West Midlands will be one of the most important elections that we have next year. I think it's the most important election Labour fights next year, because crucially, we need to win to prove that Labour is back on the road to recovery. This is the biggest metro area outside London. It's a big, old, traditional, proud economy that is now determined to show the path to Britain's green industrial future. So today, in a way, is a kickoff for us to invite you to come and get stuck in to our work shaping up that manifesto next year. I'm determined to run on a Green Labour manifesto, but I'm not going to write that. We're going to write that, and we're going to write that together. Three of the ideas, though, that I think really stand out from the conversations I've had so far with people over the last year and a half, very much to agree with what Matt has just said. This is, for us, got to be a political project. We've got to show, and this is what we want to test in the West Midlands, we want to show that Labour can win on an agenda that is primarily about how we save the planet. You know, and Labour has, I don't think, ever tried to do that in such a clear-cut way. That is what we want to do in 2021. That means three things. It means showing that we have a plan for the industries and the jobs of the future, and connecting those jobs to people, no matter, you know, what postcode you were born in. We're the party that says the postcode where you were born shouldn't define your destiny in life. That is what happens in our region at the moment. We need to break that chain. Second, we need to be the party that offers warmer homes that everyone can afford. And third, we need to be the party that champions cleaner air and longer lives. And I think around those three basic ideas, if we can show that we have a plan that is radical but realistic, that we can show that we can do these things and we know how to pay for them, then actually I think that we will win big next year. Our goal in the West Midlands is to create a Tory-free zone across the West Midlands. So we're not just trying to win the Metro Mayor. We're trying to do something a lot bigger than that. But we need your help in getting this policy agenda right. So, you know, I'll post a couple of links. You can sign up on our website, and please get stuck in.
Thank you very much for that, Liam. And clearly, all thoughts, contributions are very welcome. And I suppose what I would just sort of say in summary, there's been a number of points being put forward in both the chat box and in terms of questions around targets. I think what is really clear here is the importance of keeping our eye on the prize, and the prize is actually taking action now, because unless we act now, we will not meet any of our climate challenges. We need to act on injustice, we need to act on climate, and actually what we do in the next 5 years will determine actually what happens for the future of both the economy and our climate. I'd like to thank my colleagues on the panel. I'd very much like to thank Matt for coming in at such short notice, much appreciated. And I would like to thank Catherine, Hamish and Jake, and also Melanie, who's not, I think, don't know if she's made it to the panel, but is co-chair of CERA and has been very much part of this. And above all, she's blanked from the panel list, but has been absolutely key to pulling this together. Can I please thank Sophie Levier, who has been ensuring that we all had the right briefings and were kept in line, with Jake with his very beady eye on us all and ensuring we behave. That just actually leaves me to thank you all for taking part in this webinar. It's been great having you. I look forward to the day when we can all meet in person again, and have a good evening. Take care. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.